I am grateful for this opportunity to speak to you at this special UNCTAD conference on the digital economy and e-commerce. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in Geneva personally today, and hence I'm addressing you by this video message. Today I will speak about data, how it's evolving, the whole data economy, and what does it mean for countries, and whether countries can actually leverage data for their development. Today, as we know, data is becoming more and more strategic and more important. Over the last decade, the rise of the smartphone and now the rise of devices called the Internet of Things means that there's a humongous generation of data happening all the time. And this data is very valuable, and in fact, people talk about data as the new oil. And even when you look at the market cap of companies, 10 years back, the biggest companies in the world were oil companies, and today the biggest companies in the world are information companies that use data. So clearly data has become center stage. Now, when we look at data across the world, multiple models are emerging on how data is harnessed, how data is organized. And we believe there are broadly 4 ways about thinking about it. There's the model in the US, there's a model in Europe, there's a model in China, and there's a model in India. And I believe that the Indian model has special relevance to developing countries and countries that want to use technology and data for equitable development. In the United States, you've seen what you can think of as a laissez-faire model, where companies are allowed and encouraged to be set up. There's tremendous innovation coming out of Silicon Valley, and some great and huge companies have come out of that. But the primary function of data in the US has been the monetization of data. And we have seen the rise of large platforms that use data for benefit. And they're able to use data for benefit because the more data they have, the more they can figure out what customers want. They can launch new products and services for those customers and then acquire again more customers. So this cycle is called the network effect, and you've seen the rise of very large companies. Part of this has also been enabled by something called Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act that was passed in 1996, which essentially waived the liability of these internet or digital platforms of the content that is there on their platforms. And hence they have been able to grow very rapidly, because unlike traditional publishers of content, they are not liable for the content on their platforms. And while this has led to a tremendous surge of innovation, it has also led to other consequences. And today in the United States, they're grappling with that, whether it is the foreign meddling in elections, whether it is deciding what should be censored, whether it should be about real-time visualization of episodes like the New Zealand terrorist attack by white supremacists. So many things that are happening today, and there's a lot of discussion around the world on what to do about this. The other aspect of data, at least in the United States sense, is the monetization that happens. Today, the digital advertising market is more than $100 billion. And that is essentially, 2 large companies, Google and Facebook, have that market. And the data they have, they're able to very accurately project the ads to customers and consumers. And because of the revenue from that, they're able to give all the services free. So this is one model of data which is emerging, and it is also some of the challenges with that model are now becoming apparent. And you will see that this is a big issue today in the United States. The second approach has been the way it has been done in Europe. And Europe has always been very conscious about consumer rights, human rights, privacy. And therefore, they have done a landmark legislation last year on May 25th called the Gdpr, which essentially lays down the privacy requirements on what companies can do with people's data, the fact that they have to take consent for the data, that people have the right to be forgotten. And if companies violate these privacy laws, then they have to pay a fine up to 4% of their revenue. So you see a different model emerging in Europe, where the focus is on protecting the consumer and making sure that their data is not compromised, and making sure that the rule of governments is there to make sure companies function within a particular set of parameters. So in some sense, it is how to prevent the misuse of data by companies. The third model, which is emerging in China, and the fourth model emerging in India, are actually in some sense where the new internet is happening. Because what has happened in these two countries is that because there's been the lack of legacy technology, they don't have landlines or they don't have mainframe computers, in some sense the mobile internet has become the dominant paradigm, and in both countries there are billions of users now using smartphones and mobile internet to access services. In China, China has developed the idea of sovereignty of internet and their IT and the data, and hence they have created what is called as the Chinese firewall and allowed and enabled domestic champions to emerge. So today you see large international sized Chinese companies, Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, Didi, etc., and they become huge players, and they have become centers of innovation in the US, in China. For example, today the China is the world leader in digital payments thanks to products like WeChat from Tencent and Alipay from Alibaba, and the number of digital transactions in China far exceed anything that's happening in the rest of the world. At the same time, the Chinese view is that technology has to be harnessed for social order, for the state, and therefore their approach is how can both companies and the government use the data for having social order and so on. So that's a very different view of how data should be used. And finally, there's the Indian model, which is very, very interesting and which we think is actually a role model for the rest of the world. The Indian model is based on the premise that developing countries will have people who are data rich before they're economically rich. That means that thanks to the fact that they have access to the latest technology, the latest smartphones, the latest sensors, etc., they will generate a lot of digital footprints. If you have a person in Bihar using a smartphone, the digital footprint of that person is no less than a person in Boston using a smartphone. And therefore, we have to think, if there is going to be so much data generated, and if data is generated by people before they are fully rich or fully have all the quality of life, can we think of a model where data becomes a tool of empowerment, where data becomes something in the hands of people which allows them to improve their lives? So this is what in India is called as the data empowerment and protection architecture, and this is made possible because of a number of things. Obviously, you need a legal framework where people are entitled to get their own data back, and that's already there in the Gdpr. In India, there's a proposal to have a data privacy law. A committee was set up under the Supreme Court retired Justice Sri Krishna, which has come out with a whole policy and also a draft law on data protection and privacy, and that when implemented will provide the ability for people to get their own data back, apart from of course providing the classical benefits of privacy and so on. Because there are more than 1 billion people in India, and how do you design a system where these billion plus people can access their own data and use it at scale? And for this, we have to go back 10 years, a decade back, when the government set up a project to give every Indian a unique identity. And this was a project which I was leading. I joined this project exactly a decade back in July 2009. I retired from my role in Infosys, a company in India, and became the chairman of the Unique Identification Authority of India in the rank of a cabinet minister, with the mandate to give every Indian a unique ID, every Indian resident a unique ID. And we felt that if we are going to design an ID system in the 21st century, then it should be a digital ID. And we were dealing with a population of billion plus people. Many of them didn't have any documents, didn't have a birth certificate, didn't have an address, didn't have anything. And therefore, we used a technology concept called biometric deduplication, because we said that everybody has a unique biometric signature. In our case, it was 10 fingerprints, the iris of both the eyes, and a photograph. And we said if we can uniquely identify a person with the biometrics, then we can ensure that everybody gets a unique ID, and everybody gets an ID and they get only one ID. And that's the important concept, that a person gets only one ID. And the result of that is that today more than 1.1, 1.2 billion people have a unique ID. It's a 12-digit number they have, and that can be verified online, either with a fingerprint, an iris, or with an OTP, or with a face match. So it's a very sophisticated digital ID program with online authentication and online verification. But the other very important part of the India stack is what I referred to earlier, which is the data empowerment capabilities. And the data empowerment capabilities essentially using technology so that people can harness their own data for their own benefit. And this requires some kind of an ID system, because you need to be able to do a real-time authentication of an individual before you can release that data from some source. And therefore, the ID system or some kind of an authentication system for everybody is required for data empowerment. So in India, we are fortunate to have Aadhaar and the India stack. And the way data empowerment works is there are a set of organizations or databases which are information providers. And there are a set of organizations or databases which are information consumers. And the system is designed so a person can get his or her own data from any producer and give it to any consuming company. And to orchestrate this movement of data from producer to consumer on my behalf, there's a new category of entities that have been sort of defined, called data fiduciaries, who play the role of being the sort of good cop of moving data around. And this infrastructure of producer, fiduciary, and consumer has specifically been implemented in India's financial sector. In India's financial sector, which has many regulators like the Reserve Bank of India for banking and SEBI for capital markets and so on, they defined a concept of these entities called account aggregators. And account aggregators are licensed, and there are already 5 or 6 account aggregators who have got an operating license from the central bank. And they will, on behalf of a consumer, they will get data from one financial information producer or provider and give it to a consumer. So to give you specifically an example in the financial sector, I can ask for my data from my bank or from the income tax department or from my GST system or from wherever else, and I can get that data, and the account aggregator cannot see my data, but on my behalf they can pass it on to a consumer of the data, and that person decides whether I'm eligible to get a loan or whether I can buy a mutual fund or whatever. But what important thing is this is happening at scale. So 1 billion people are able to access this infrastructure to get data from one place and give it to another place. And the implementation is also designed to be, can be done in multiple domains. So the current infrastructure that is getting rolled out is in the financial sector, but the same architecture and the same solutions can be done in the health sector, the education sector, and so on. And that is the journey that India is embarking on. And we think that this is a radically new way of looking at data from the point of view of the consumer or the individual or the citizen, and empowering them with their own data. And to create such a system is a combination of laws and regulations, technology, and new institutions. And it requires all these things to be brought together to make it happen. And this is something which India is working on. And I'm very happy to have a chance to present this at UNCTAD and suggest that it is something worth doing. And I would request everybody present to think about how do nations think about data. And if they really want data to be empowering, if they want data to be for development, and if they want their citizens to utilize the data to improve their lives. Is there a way to do it? And this is a way that we think is possible, and urge you to have a look and see what you can do, and I'll be more than happy to share more details if required. Thank you very, very much, and have a great conference.